Okay, if you could make your way in and get a seat, we are going to start the final session of this year's Biblical Worldview Conference. And we're very appreciative of our speakers. And I know you've probably enjoyed and gained a lot. And we've got a final session here with Israel Wayne. Israel has introduced himself, and so I probably don't have to do much introduction, but he was reminding me that we first met when all my children were in the home, let's just say that. And so that's probably about 20 some years ago, about 20 years ago or so. And we've been blessed with his work, and he has become quite an influential and sought after speaker, particularly in the homeschool convention circle. And you can tell by what he's been teaching here, he doesn't bring just softball stuff. He challenges us in worldview thinking and application in our home. Today, for our final session, he's going to be speaking on Christians and pop culture, evaluating the arts. And so very useful teaching on our interactions with the culture, which has definitely been a theme for this conference. Again, I'll come up and give a few other announcements, but we will have the book tables open for a little while afterwards for any of you that haven't been able to make your final purchases. So at this time, will you please welcome up Israel Wayne?
This session is entitled Christians and Pop Culture, Evaluating the Arts. And this is really part 2 of David's keynote message this morning on culture. So for those of you who got to hear that, this is sort of picking up where he left off and continuing it. So I want to talk about the arts and evaluating it from within a biblical worldview. The arts are an expression of culture, and culture is an expression of religion. Henry Van Til, who was quoted extensively this morning, said culture is nothing other than religion externalized and made explicit. Oftentimes I've thought that if you go to a culture, let's say that you were transported somehow and dropped into another country and you know nothing about where you are, you could tell certain things about the people who live there simply by looking at their architecture, looking at their cuisine, looking at their food, their clothing, and just examining the way that they express themselves externally, because the way that they express themselves externally in their daily life is an expression of their beliefs and their values, and their beliefs and values are an expression of what they believe about God. So all culture ultimately has presuppositions about God and his existence. So I want to try to define art a little bit. Art can be defined as an outward expression of the values of a culture, society, or community. Scott Armstrong, a Christian apologist, said, "Culture is more than a society's art, but its art is perhaps the best barometer of its worldview." Now, when I use the term art or the arts or creative arts, I am not just limiting that to paintings and drawings, but I am referring also to things like poetry, drama, literature, theater, movies, computer graphics, web design, comic books, music, video games, and various forms of visual and auditory entertainment. So we're looking at a broader range of artistic expression that is involved. There's a book that was mentioned earlier by Ken Myers called All God's Children in Blue Suede Shoes. This is the older cover. So if you go online and you look for it, there are 2 different covers. The one with the shoes on the front is actually the newest one that has the new forward. But Ken Myers was a host of a radio program on National Public Radio, NPR, called All Things Considered. Anybody here ever listen to NPR? Okay, yeah, because we're going to have a time of prayer and repentance for those of you who do. No, I'm just kidding. But Ken Myers, unlike most of NPR, which is very liberal, this is many years ago that he was a host there. But yeah, NPR is very liberal, but Ken Myers is not. He is actually a Christian. He is an elder at a PCA church, Presbyterian church, and is one of the most thoughtful analysts of culture that I know of anywhere, but particularly the fact that he approaches things from a biblical framework, I find particularly interesting and compelling. He's the host of a program that's kind of like All Things Considered, but from a Christian perspective, called Mars Hill Audio. And you can find that at marshillaudio.org. It's a subscription-based audio program, and I enjoy listening to it very much. But I had an opportunity to interview Ken Myers on this topic of culture. And so usually he's the host and he's interviewing other people, but I was blessed to be able to interview him. So I'm going to share with you some quotes from my personal interview with Ken Myers on the topic of culture. And we talked about three different types of culture: folk culture, high culture, and popular culture or pop culture. And as we go forward, I'm going to try to give you the defining characteristics of all three. So we're going to start with folk culture because that's the culture that America really began with in its early history. He says this: for most of human history, most cultural experience was in this category. It is usually used to describe the cultural expressions that came from a particular community or people of a particular folk. So folk culture is generally local. What we have are efforts for the community to pass on its values to the next generation. So the intent of folk culture was the transmission of values from one generation to the next. When you think about American society today, I think the people group that most defines folk culture in America would be the Amish. The Amish have passed on traditions, customs, behaviors, a way of life, ways of practice and living that have been very intentional in wanting to pass on particular values. Even their refusal to bring electricity inside of their homes and their refusal to drive automobiles is intentional on their part, and it expresses not merely their beliefs and values, but their religious beliefs and values, because all culture ultimately is religious. But they are, in many ways, a great expression of folk culture. Their art is, I think, some of the remnants that we would have of what would be considered folk art. You could go back to the Shakers, who are a group that died out in American history that had, I think, a similar intent. One of the mistakes that the Shakers embraced was the concept of celibacy, and that will kill a movement quite rapidly. The Amish did not embrace the cult of celibacy, and they have been able to reproduce and to pass on those transcendent values from one generation to another. High culture, he says, might be described as a more refined and complicated version of the same kind of thing, but often produced for a more dispersed audience. One of the easiest examples of high culture that we would probably be familiar with would be classical music. High culture doesn't have the kind of rustic and local characteristics about it, but I think until recently that high culture did have a similar intent to folk culture. So one of the values of high culture was to try to pass on the transcendent ideals of the true, the good, and the beautiful. Pop culture is a more modern invention, and he says this: pop culture is generally produced for a mass audience, usually distributed by the mass media. It is designed more for the purpose of sheer entertainment than for passing on values of the true, good, and or beautiful. It also tends to be, as a result of that, more of a commodity we buy or something we consume rather than something we inhale from the nursery on, as would be the case with folk culture. It's more of a consumer phenomenon. Popular culture isn't really culture in the traditional sense. Culture traditionally was a mechanism not only in passing on values from one generation to the next, but culture was a mechanism of restraint. of keeping people from doing everything they wanted to do. Most popular culture is designed to liberate people rather than restrain them. It basically detaches people from that cultural sense of moral obligation. When you think about people who are growing up in rural America or small town or agrarian America, there was a culture that was restraining in terms of values. When you grew up in your little neighborhood with all of your family and your extended family, and your neighbors are your cousins and your aunts and uncles and your grandparents, and everybody knows everybody, there were certain things you wouldn't do because everybody would know and everybody would talk. And so there was a moral restraint that happened within society, and pop culture has changed that. Now, I want to look at some of the factors that led us away from agrarian folk culture to pop culture. And actually, these points on this slide were actually bullet points from a book by Josh McDowell called Right from Wrong, where he talked about how there was a shift, a paradigm shift, he called it, in culture, that these things contributed to the paradigm shift. So let me say something that's not in my notes. There was a phenomenon that happened in the mid-19th century, and that was the American Civil War, the war between the states, where you have 600,000 men who die. That's going to change your nation. And so you have then a massive fatherless issue. You have women who have been living on family farms, which was the primary source of income, and they move to the cities because now all of a sudden after the war, you have a time of reconstruction, and you have urbanization and factories that are being built as the industrial revolution is beginning. And so these moms who no longer have a husband, but they have children to raise, they move into the cities and the moms go into the factories. And at the same time, you have Horace Mann in Massachusetts who incorporates the first compulsory attendance laws in 1852, which spread across the country to where by 1900, every state has embraced compulsory attendance laws. So you have a bunch of things that are converging where you have industrialization, you have urbanization, people moving out of an agrarian farm lifestyle to the cities, work shifting from family enterprise to the corporation, the factory, women leaving the homes, and then having to put the children into government schools so that they have some place to be. There's a lot of things that happen culturally that forced America, if you will, in a certain direction. And so some of these things that Josh McDowell talks about, like the urbanization of society, also was joined about the same time with a great expansion in mass transportation. The railroad could now get you from one side of the country to the other. But then, of course, coming around the beginning of the 20th century, you have the automobile, which gives people, an exponentially greater ability to move from one place to another. You also have the normalization of higher education, where parents begin to send their children away from home to cities, where the children at 18 years old now are in an urban environment on a campus away from their parents, and they're being detached from this sense of moral restraint that was part of this agrarian, local, provincial culture that existed prior to the time of the war. So there's a lot of things that are happening here. And of course, with industrialization and all of this, you have the rise of materialism, and you have a new consumer culture. And this is one of the things that I constantly try to talk to my children about, is that there's two mentalities or two mindsets that everyone will bring to life. There's the mentality of being a producer and the mentality of being a consumer. Now, all of us are consumers to some level. We all buy things, we purchase things, we use things. We are all marketed to and sold products as consumers. But there's an ideology that many people have where they sort of identify as consumers, and they see work or job or employment and therefore their earnings as a means to be able to be consumers, to simply buy for the purpose of convenience and comfort, pleasure, entertainment, etc. So what I try to encourage my children to do as a dad is to have a mentality of being a producer. And I'm going to go off script here, but this is something that I've been thinking about for a while. Just maybe will help illustrate this idea of folk culture moving into popular culture. I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, but I just think I want to insert it right here. If you were to go to the Appalachian Mountains in the late 1800s, and you were walking on a dirt road, and you see a log cabin up on the side of the hill, you may hear, coming from the front porch, music that is being produced by teenagers on instruments that, in some cases, they made themselves. Banjos, mandolins, lap dulcimers, guitars. They may have actually handcrafted their own wooden instruments, and they are playing bluegrass music, for example, that they themselves wrote. And they are producing this art, they're producing this music in community with their cousins and their siblings and their friends and their relatives. And so they are producing art in community with other people to whom they are deeply linked in relationship. Okay? So you have this in the late, even really in the early 1900s. Okay, you move to the 1950s and 60s, and something radical has changed in the way that we interface with music. So some of you are going to be old enough to know this phenomenon, and in some ways it extended really into the 1970s as well. So the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s, if you grew up in that era, you're going to identify with what I'm talking about. We shifted, again, I'm getting ahead of myself here, but we shifted away from folk culture to pop culture, where now we're not creating music, we're consuming music. We are buying music that we are listening to. And in those days, the way that we interfaced with music was not these instruments that we were playing. We weren't creating something, especially not instruments we made ourselves. We were listening to music on a turntable console in our living room that was the size of a coffin. Okay? And what music were we listening to? We were not listening to whatever kind of music we wanted to listen to. No, au contraire, we were listening to our parents' music. Why? Because they bought the music. Because our parents had money and we did not. And they were the parents. And so they purchased the music and they played the music. So depending on your age, if you were really, older, you might have grown up with Glenn Miller. If you were, a little bit younger, you might have grown up with Sinatra. Maybe a little bit younger, maybe you grew up with Elvis. If you were my generation, you grew up with Creedence Clearwater Revival. You grew up with the music of your parents. Our generation, the baby boomers and the older Gen Xers, we all knew and know our parents' music. And so songs come on when you're out and about on Muzak, and we identify with it, and we have memories that take us back because it was our parents' music, and we remember sitting in the living room listening to it play throughout the house. You couldn't escape it, right? Everybody in the house heard their music, and everyone in those generations knew their parents' music. It's interesting that Kevin Swanson, when he did the Gen 2 survey, he found that there is a correlation between children who like their parents' music and have the same values as their parents. I thought that was a fascinating thing. Correlation, not necessarily causation, but correlation. And I think part of it is that it shows that there is a family culture that works. There's a family culture where we're doing things together. So we're consuming art, we're consuming music together, but we're doing it together as a family. There's a shared experience. Fast forward to today, how do people interface with music today? They interface with music either with an iPod or a smartphone and earbuds, where they are a universe of one. They are consuming music, but they have their own playlist, they have their own shuffle, and no one in the house knows what they're listening to. Parents don't know the music of their children's generation, and children no longer know the music of their parents' generation. It's been cut off, it's been separated. So the way that we interface, even with music, has changed in at least those 3 stages that I see from a little over 100 years ago, to where we were producers of music, to we were consumers, but we still did so in relationship and community. Now we are autonomous individual consumers. So none of that's in my notes, that's all free. But I'm trying to show how we have shifted culturally away from a folk culture to a popular culture of consumerism and individualism in ways that we probably didn't even see coming. It just happened so gradually that we ended up where we are now without even understanding the drift. Again, Ken Myers talks about media and how media, national media, was a huge part of this cultural shift. He said if people don't have access to mass media, they can't have a popular culture. One of the things that created popular culture initially was the radio, because people could listen to the same broadcasting now all across the United States when you had national radio. And then television came along, I believe in the 1950s. I wasn't around then, so I'm taking other people's word for it. And when television came along, you had a few standardized channels where you could watch a few programs, right? The I Love Lucy or whatever. And so for the first time ever, the way that we received information changed, because before that, information tended to be received more locally and provincially. You read your local newspaper, you talked to your neighbors, you talked to your friends, you found out what was going on around the world when your friends or relatives from another part of the country came to visit you and you said, hey, what's going on in Denver? You didn't know unless someone from Denver came to visit you. Well, now all of a sudden, there are shared experiences that people have never had before, where someone in Tallahassee, Florida can call someone in Seattle, Washington and say, hey, what did you think of that episode of I Love Lucy last night? Someone in Portland, Maine could call someone in Phoenix, Arizona, have a conversation, and we all share experience. What's beginning to happen is now all of a sudden there is a mass populace that's beginning to form because we've all had the same shared cultural experiences. It's very hard to create a homogenization of society when everyone is getting different information from different information streams. So mass media has contributed dramatically to the rise of popular culture. He also says that discretionary income was necessary for pop culture. He says, quote, if people don't have a standard of living to allow a certain amount of leisure, high culture is hard to maintain. He also speaks about the concept of planned obsolescence. This is the idea that things that are sold to us with the idea that they're already out of date before we even buy them. And I put the photo of the iPhone because nothing is probably a better representation of planned obsolescence than the smartphones, right? I mean, I remember when I got the iPhone 10, I had this moment of satisfaction, of being cool for 5 minutes until one of the people at the Apple store said, yeah, we're expecting the 12 soon. I said, why? But I just got the 10. And they're like, yeah, but that's last Tuesday. Yeah, we're waiting for 12. 12 is going to be, you're going to want the 12 because it's like light years beyond the 10. And then they crushed me. It's like, okay, I have this stupid 10 now, a worthless piece of junk, right? Created this dissatisfaction in me before I even got out of the store with my iPhone. And so this is part of what corporations do. They want us to be dissatisfied with what we have so that we have to go buy the coolest, latest, hippest, fastest, newest, whatever. So he says pop culture is built on a principle of planned obsolescence. It's designed to be ephemeral and fleeting. So much of course, marketing drives this whole concept of why we're supposed to buy and consume. So this homogenization of our nation's worldviews resulted because of this development of a pop culture or a mass culture. And so these more local tastes and viewpoints began to dissipate as we started to develop big box stores, fast food chains, top 20 radio, and then of course, I think the government school system has created a homogenization of values that shifted a whole nation in a certain direction because they have access to the students and they have a standardized curriculum, and so they can create a standardized populace. In his book, The God Who Is There, Dr. Francis Schaeffer talked about what he called the line of despair. I've illustrated it a little bit differently here graphically in that I have these concepts within a circle because I sort of see it as a continual loop, not merely a line, but more of a continual loop that is descending in a downward trajectory. And he talked about how despair takes hold in a culture when theologians give up the authority of Scripture and reverence of God. And from that, which happened in Germany, of course, in the late 19th century, you had the deconstruction of biblical authority through higher criticism. But as despair came into theology, theology impacts philosophy. And so philosophy, of course, impacts the arts and entertainment. The arts and entertainment impact general culture, which is you and I, living our everyday lives. Why? Because much of the worldview, particularly of young people, is shaped by music and by movies and by television and entertainment. It shapes their values, it shapes their beliefs. And then sadly, the church is now being influenced by the popular culture rather than the church transforming culture. The church is being transformed by culture. And so you see a greater depth of despair and relativism and all of that creep into the church, which starts the whole cycle over again. So the only way that you get out of this cycle or of this downward spiral is at some point, one of these agencies here is going to have to decide to get out of the spiral. Well, you know that the only agency that has the capacity to do that is the church, right? And so at some point, the church is going to have to stop the endless cycle of being influenced by the culture and the values of the culture. It is going to have to start being the church once again and influencing the culture, which will make it somewhat revolutionary in a sense and will put it at odds with the culture, which will create friction, which is difficult, but there must be, as Dr. Schaeffer said, confrontation. Loving confrontation, but confrontation nonetheless. So as despair began to come into the arts, we began to see this creep in so many different ways. Some of you who are older may remember Jackson Pollock, who lived from 1912 to 1956. Pollock believed in an evolutionary worldview that was predicated on chance. And so he, to illustrate that in his art, laid out canvases on the floor, and he took buckets of paint of different colors, and he attached these buckets to ropes that were on pulleys, mechanical pulleys, and he could turn a switch and the motor would run and these buckets of paint would begin to spin around the room, open and splash paint out onto canvases, empty canvases on the floor. And then after a while, he would turn the switch off and he would retrieve his canvases. As you can see, an example of his artwork there. He created art that reflected chaos and chance. This was an expression of his worldview, of his philosophy of life, and his philosophy of life was influenced by his religious presuppositions. There is no God, everything is accidental, and so his art was seeking to represent that. In music, you had, I choke on saying the word composers, like John Cage, who was influenced by Zen Buddhism, and he specialized in chants music. A lot of chance music was defined by taking a musical staff and simply writing notes randomly at various places on the staff and then playing whatever came out. And of course, it sounded horrible and terrible and dreadful, and yet these academic elites would applaud it and say, oh, what beautiful music. And it was representing, once again, belief of nihilism, that everything is purposeless, it's all meaningless, it's all governed by chance. John Cage's most famous composition, which I'll put that word in quotes, was a little piece called 433, where he would go to a piano and he would sit silently at the piano, not touching the keys, for a space of 4 minutes and 33 seconds, playing absolutely no notes. And then he would stand up and bow to the audience, and he would get standing ovations, and people raved about this, and he received much critical acclaim. What brilliance! What an artist! And yet this was postmodernism beginning to infiltrate the culture, as we had given up on the idea that modernism introduced the idea that there was truth. Modernism believed in truth. There was truth, but there was only scientific and mathematical truth. There was not moral truth. There wasn't ethical truth. There wasn't spiritual truth. The only things we could be certain of were things that were empirical, things that could be tested scientifically in a laboratory with a microscope or a test tube. So there were things we could know with certainty, but they were only mathematical and scientific truths. That's what modernism promoted. Postmodernism promoted the idea that we can know nothing with certainty. Nothing has a fixed reference point. There is no objective definition for anything. Words are meaningless, and everything is meaningless and chance. So what is the purpose of pop culture? We'll kind of review here for a second. Number one, planned obsolescence. Number two, the purpose of planned obsolescence is to create discontent in the buyer. Number three, creating consumers rather than producers. I just quickly, I may have shared this here in a previous year, I don't remember, but there was a occasion I had where I was flying out to Montana for an event, and as I was sitting on the plane, there was a young lady who was about my age, and she was going to Montana as well. We're both flying from Chicago, and I asked her what she did for a living, and she told me that she was a designer. Some of you will probably remember me sharing this illustration, but she was a designer for Ann Taylor. And I said, oh, who is she? Which, of course, I outed myself as being ignorant on Ann Taylor. So she said, well, Ann Taylor is not a she, it's a corporation. I said, oh, okay, I didn't know that. What does Ann Taylor do? And she said, Ann Taylor designs high-end business apparel for women. I said, whew, okay, well, that's not, I'm obviously not their demographic, right? So, and I said, well, where do they sell these kinds of clothes? And she said, mostly in malls. And of course, I don't go to malls. So again, I was like, all right, I feel somewhat justified that I don't know who this is. But I asked her a question about how often they can convince women to throw out their wardrobe and get all new apparel. And she said, well, our clothes are pretty expensive. And so she said, really, we're hoping that, every year or two that we can get a woman to say, I have to get rid of everything in my closet and start all over. But, with the price of our clothes, it's kind of a difficult sell. But that's our goal. Kind of every 1 or 2 years, got to completely start over. I said, I would think that the teen market, you can turn things over a lot quicker than that. And she said, oh, absolutely. She said, we love, as fashion designers, we love the teen market. She said, what's great about the teen market is that you don't really have to use quality materials. You don't really need much of it. And so, but you can charge really high prices. So use really cheap materials, it doesn't have to cover much of their body. And you can charge a lot of it. And she said, and the beauty of it is you can convince, especially teenage girls, to throw out their entire wardrobe and start over every month or two in order to remain fashionable, to be in the in group with their friends. It was fascinating to me, speaking to someone who works in marketing for one of these companies, just hearing them give the psychology behind this, that the goal is very directly to make us discontent as consumers, so we keep giving them our money. And so part of this, again, there's got to be a certain level of indoctrination that goes along with this. So point 4, creating masses who think alike or group think. And number 5, this leads us, of course, to political correctness. So what is the purpose of true creativity from a biblical framework? I would say number 1, purpose of true creativity is to reflect God's image, the Imago Dei. Number 2, to inspire thought. Number 3, to give a message of hope. Number 4, for others to enjoy. Number 5, to make a living. It's certainly acceptable for someone in the creative arts to make a living creating artistic expression. I remember some years ago, before he died, I had an opportunity to meet Thomas Kincaid, the painter of light. And one of the questions that I asked him was if he had been influenced by Dr. Francis Schaeffer in any way, if that influenced his perspective on art. And he said that he was influenced by Dr. Schaeffer. When I asked specifically how, he said that beauty has value in itself because beauty is an attribute of God. And so when we reflect beauty, we reflect what God is like, and there's value in that. And then I asked him another question. I said, I read in an article one time that you said that you create art that would express what the world would be like if there had been no fall. If the world was not corrupted by the fall, you're painting pictures of what you think the world would be like if the fall hadn't happened. I said, is that true? Is that why you paint the way you do? And does that motivate you? Is that your perspective in creating these paintings? And he actually thought about it for a good while. And then he said, no. And what's interesting is a friend of mine told me that he asked the same question and that Kincaid told him yes. But in my case, he waited a long time and he thought about it. And then he said, no, not in a theological sense, no. He said, in fact, he said, the fall is a fact. And he said, as artists, we have to express brokenness because it's part of the Christian theology. He said, the thing that I struggle with is, he said, I look at what's popular now. At that particular time, Gothic art was really popular, particularly among teenagers, which had a very dark and depressing and sometimes even suicidal bent to it. And he said, I could create Gothic art, for example, but he said, what message does that leave? He said, ultimately, it just leaves a message of despair. And if I'm going to put my efforts into doing something, I don't want to leave someone with a message of despair. He said, if you read through the Psalms, you will find that in the overview of the Psalms, there are psalms of lament. And we have to be willing to explore that as part of the body of our work. He said, in fact, I consider my magnum opus, the greatest piece that I ever painted, the painting of the cross, which if you ever go to Billy Graham's library in North Carolina, there's a mural of the cross there at Billy Graham's library that Thomas Kincaid painted, and it's housed there. But he said, I consider that to be the greatest thing I've ever painted in my life. And he said, if that does not express the fall, if that does not express sin and death and all of them with it, I don't know what does. But he said, but what I want to do is I want to create a message of hope, because what makes something Christian is that it Okay. Oh, I see right here. I'll turn this on and we'll see if it works, and if it okay, we'll see if it stays on. If it dies again, we'll switch it out. So he said, within a Christian story, you can have conflict, you can have struggle, but at the end of the day, ultimately, it has to resolve. And as Christians, that really is our eschatology. Okay, so really in our eschatology, there is this promise of the restoration of all things. And that really is, I think, one of the things that makes Christian art or Christian creativity different, is that the world has no ultimate hope. And as believers, we do. When we talk about evaluating the arts from a biblical worldview, in order for us to talk about the arts or art, we have to have some universal standard definition. Because if we do not have any type of objective metric or measurement to evaluate what is good art versus what is bad art, or even if there aren't categories, objective categories that talk about what is and what is not, then we don't know how to even discuss or define art. It's meaningless to even talk about it as a category. So this is an actual photo that someone took of a guy at an art museum as he is standing contemplating the spherical design of a trash can and probably pondering its significance as a expression of existentialism or something. The difficulty is, if there is no such thing as non-art, if there's no objective metric by which we judge art versus non-art, it's meaningless to speak about it. If there's not non-art, then everything is art. If there's not such a thing as non-art, you don't know what to put inside of an art museum and what to leave out. A Rembrandt painting is just equally as much art as the trash can if there is no objective standard. So this whole idea that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, what's art to you may not be art to me, that whole subjective worldview that the postmodern era has given us is objectively false. It has to be. So I want to look at a few criteria by which we can evaluate the arts. A great little book, if you want to do further study, is Dr. Francis Schaeffer wrote a small book most people haven't read called Art and the Bible, which is a really good one. There's also one called State of the Arts by Jean Edward Veith, which is a great book. And there are some others. But in Exodus 31, 2 through 6, God talks about how he called Bezalel and Uri, the son of Hur, and he said, I filled them with the Spirit of God in wisdom and understanding, knowledge, and all manner of workmanship, to design artistic works, to work in gold, silver, and bronze, in cutting jewels for setting, and carving wood, and to work in all manner of workmanship. And I indeed have appointed with him a bunch of names that are not in a baby book. I'll give you that much. And then I've put my wisdom in the hearts of all these gifted artisans so that they may make all that I have commanded you. So God gave these people the ability to create artistically. In Psalm 33:3, we're commanded by God to play skillfully in music, not merely to play, but to play skillfully. So the first criteria by which we evaluate whether something is art versus non-art is technical excellence, and that involves degree of difficulty. Something that has a very high degree of difficulty we consider to be a better form of art than something that has a lesser form of difficulty. There's also the aspect of validity and integrity, and there's 4 categories here that, again, Schaeffer talks about. One is there are Christians who create art that's consistent with a Christian worldview. There are Christians who create art that is consistent with a non-Christian worldview. There are non-Christians who create art that's consistent with a non-Christian worldview, and non-Christians who create art that is consistent with a Christian worldview. 2 of these categories would be considered artistically valid, and 2 of them would not. The ones that would be considered artistically valid would be Christians who produce art with a Christian worldview and non-Christians who produce art with a non-Christian worldview. Why? Because they are producing something that is true to their beliefs and their values. Again, culture being an expression of their beliefs and values are rooted in their religion. The other category, really people who are just engaged in commercialism, who just want to sell a product. And that is not something that we would call art. We would call that commercialism. So there obviously are moral principles that we can apply to the content of art, and we as Christians can be very good at this, where we look at the lyrics of a song, the storyline of a book, the object that's painted, how many curse words are in a movie, or objectionable scenes. the more fundamentalist you are in the Christian community, the better you are skilled at evaluating the content of art to say, does this conform to or meet with a biblical worldview? Where we're a little less skilled is in the category of evaluating the form and the methodology of art. And this is also important because God cares not only for the content that is being delivered, but the method or the vehicle that is being used to transmit the content. And the vehicle and the content together form the message. So there's a book that was written in 1964 by Marshall McLuhan. It says, it's called Understanding Media, the Extensions of Man. And his famous quote from this book is, "The medium is the message." There are times where the message can be overshadowed. Can't think of exactly how to word this. But you think about a movie, for example. What is the movie's message? The movie's message is not merely the script. You start with a script, right? That's the words. But the movie is so much more. The message of the movie is so much more. What do you have as other components to that? You have a musical score. You have lighting. You have camera angles that move in and out and fade out. You have acting. Much of communication is not merely words, it is facial expressions. In fact, a lot of people say that most communication is not words, it's posture, it's facial expressions, it's body language. We communicate things. If I say, "Yeah, right," you're trying to interpret what I meant by that by my tone of voice, aren't you? Or if I go, "Yeah, right." Or if I go, "Yeah, right." I mean, I'm using the same words, but the message has changed, hasn't it? Just by my tone of voice, my inflection. There's so much involved in the vehicle, the way that the material is presented. One quick example of this that haunts me to this day, when I was a teenager and I was in youth group, we had a youth leader who thought he was a comedian. And there are very few things in life worse than that. But he had this thing that he loved to do to us at church camp, where he would have us all sing, and I'm going to date myself here. I'm going to show you how outdated I am. He would have us all sing the words to Amazing Grace, set to the music of the old 1970s television show Gilligan's Island. How many of you have had the horror of experiencing this in your life? God has been good to you. The only way that I can actually kind of express this to you, unfortunately, please forgive me in advance, is just actually do it. But the meter works, which is dreadful. And the younger people are going, "Gilligan's Island, I don't even know what that is." Gilligan's Island was a TV sitcom in the 70s that was about these people who got stranded on an island, and they were stuck there for years because they didn't know how to build a boat. You know, they could build a shortwave radio out of coconuts, but they couldn't fix a boat. Anyway, so the song he would have us sing went like, "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see, was blind, but now I see. We've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun," right? And he'd have us sing this, and we're all getting nauseated. We're like, "I need Dramamine right now. I really do. I'm feeling motion sick." Well, what happens when you set the words of Amazing Grace to the tune of Gilligan's Island? All of a sudden, you're no longer thinking about what a wretch you are and how amazing it is that God has saved you. If you're my age, you're thinking of a stupid guy in a pith hat on an island, being annoying. But at any rate, you lose the message in the music. It's not merely the lyrics. The music has taken over the message of the song. I think about the Hallelujah chorus, which was written by Handel. And I believe that is the greatest piece of music ever written in the history of humankind. And you're free to disagree with me on that. It's a free country. You can be wrong. But I love bluegrass music. But if you were to set the Hallelujah chorus to bluegrass music, you're going to lose something. It's not the same thing as Handel's arrangement. So even like a sermon delivery, so many things, the way that something is communicated is important. So this is another question that we ask. So I'm just going to go through this real quick. Technical excellence, these are points to evaluate the arts. Validity or integrity, looking at the content, is it consistent with a Christian worldview? Does the form match the content? Does the vehicle match the content that's being transmitted? And then what is the standard, right? The standard, of course, is God's nature and character, which he has expressed in his word, Philippians 4:8 being a good example of that, the things that are true, honorable, just, pure, lovely, commendable, praiseworthy things, excellent things. This is the standard by which we judge things that are artistic. A couple of helpful questions. We should ask questions if we know anything about the artist. What is their relationship with God? What is their worldview and their intent? We should be mindful that the creative arts often seek to bypass our intellect and go straight to our emotions. Now, movies are more powerful than almost anything at this because they use all of the creative arts. They use music, and they use drama, and they use acting and lighting and filming to bypass the intellect and touch the emotion. And that's why they're so powerful and can be powerful in a good way, but they can also be very powerful for evil. So as Christians who create art, we want to create art that is consistent with a biblical worldview. We want to make sure that it glorifies God, that we express love and service to others. And then I also think it's interesting that there's almost an antithesis or a contrast between worship and entertainment. I think that worship in many ways is an antithesis of entertainment, in that entertainment is all about me. I'm a sponge, and I am listening to my iPod, and I'm soaking everything in as a universe of one, and it's all about me, preferences, what I get out of it, makes me feel. Worship is the opposite of that. Worship is coming out of ourselves to our praise and adoration, not of ourselves, but to God. And God expects us to worship him not in the way that we want to worship him, but to worship him in the way that he wants to be worshiped. And so worship is the coming out of ourselves as opposed to the turning into ourselves. And I find it ironic that the way that the church has decided to draw people into the building increasingly has been through entertainment as opposed to actual worship. And what you draw them in with, you end up having to keep them with. And this is why Charles Spurgeon said that the church has become more preoccupied with entertaining the goats than feeding the sheep. And so we are commanded in the scripture with creativity to work with all of our might in Ecclesiastes 9:10, and to do what we do as unto the Lord and not unto men. Again, I'd like you to check out, if you haven't done so, my Foundations in Faith, Bible Doctrine and Theology curriculum. This is, again, a resource that's created for high school students, but really works well with adults as well, especially I think would be helpful for new believers who have never gone through the basic primary doctrines of the Christian faith. Also in my book, Education, Does God Have an Opinion? I have a whole section on evaluating the arts from a biblical worldview. In this book, I take what is a biblical philosophy of literature, what's a biblical philosophy of mathematics, what's a biblical philosophy of history, of language arts, of all of these different subjects, of logic, philosophy, and so forth. And so I take the different academic subjects and I talk about how there's a humanistic philosophy of these subjects and there is a biblical philosophy. So my books are back there on the table. You can purchase them through Biblical Worldview Learning Center. David Barrett will be able to take the orders for you. Again, we have a special bundle package where if you get all 6 of the books, it's only $60 instead of the normal $78. Still have some USB drives back there that have 75 hours of audio teaching, about 60 hours of audio, and 15 hours of video on lots of different topics. There's a sheet that lists those out. My ministry is Family Renewal, and our website is familyrenewal.org. We're on all the social media platforms, so we'd love to connect with you there, and would also love to have you sign up on our email list, either back there on the paper at the booth or just by scanning the QR code with your phone. So again, I'd like to express my appreciation to David Barrett, to the Barrett family, to Wellspring Church for sponsoring this. Could we just give them a hand, please? They put a lot into this. Thank you.